We were really, really pleased in the spirit of NetDevOps Days and community when Networked Code came on board, and especially pleased when Jason decided to get on a plane and fly all the way over here to talk to us today. Let's have a massive round of applause for Mr. Jason Edelman.
Again, thank you again. My name is Jason Edelman. We're going to talk about transforming enterprises and careers with network automation. And for the last 9 years or so, 10 years, maybe even 11, I've been fortunate enough to sort of, I feel like be neck deep in network automation. And over these years, I've worked with a lot of folks in the community, a lot of customers, and this presentation is really kind of like an aggregation of things that we've seen at Networked Code. And hopefully there's some tidbits along the way that could help accelerate the folks in the room's journey as they either embark or try to accelerate their own journey. So who am I? As I said, my name is Jason Edelman, based in New Jersey, the New York City area, born and raised and proud of New Jersey. What does that mean? I'll probably talk fast. Time to slow down if I'm going too fast. But I have a networking background. Spent time at Cisco in 2004 or 5 in the early years. Went to a large VAR in the US, and then really I became an early evangelist of SDN network automation in like the 2011, 12, 13 timeframe. And that really led to starting Networked Code, really with the sole mission to transform the industry. It was just antiquated, still very much CLI driven. And I think back personally, I spent a lot of time in front of customers and doing technical sales. And I think back around, we would, literally, have great dinners and high five on these big contracts with clients, really without kind of giving a care of what's going to happen day 2. Like literally, how are they going to install, hundreds or thousands of devices? Actually going beyond the install, how are they going to operate it day to day? And that was really the motivation, right, years ago to start Networked Code, and still 9 years later, we're going strong and hopefully doing our part to transform the industry with open source and community and things like that. Also a co-author of a book that came out years ago. Version 2 is coming out hopefully shortly as well. We have folks on our team that are continuing with the O'Reilly book version 2. Fun fact, I've been in London a bunch over the years. How many folks here have attended the London Network Automation Meetup at some point? Small group, yeah, I'd recommend it. Pre-pandemic, it was going really strong, a couple times a year. Post-pandemic, it's been maybe once a year, twice a year. But I really do believe London has one of the richest network automation groupings that I've been a part of, and it's awesome to see this come together within a month, and I'm sure over the next few years we'll continue to see the growth. So that said, what's the plan for today? I'll start with a few minutes of overall context, setting the stage. I think probably by now it's pretty obvious of, again, why we're here. But there's also the question of build versus buy. I'll say it again a couple times, but it's very catchy, it's very clickbaity. We'll talk a little about build versus buy, talk about the role of data in network automation, and then also talk about that transformation of skills and career, and how that really maps back to that transformation that organizations are also making. So I think over the last 12 months, 24 months, 36 months, the hands raised earlier during Pete's presentation was great to see all of the folks that are already embarking. And I think at some point, this is the feeling, right? Anybody in the room felt like this in the past couple of years, is sort of, as you kind of embark on the journey, it starts maybe with one product, one tool, and to use it, you got to learn 3 more acronyms. And so I give all the credit in the world for those that are embarking on this journey. I think when we look at the DevOps space and SREs and sysadmins, I feel like it's been more of a gradual transition in the past 10 plus years. In networking, it just seems like it was jumping right in and kind of treading water for a while, and then eventually things start to click. So again, a huge credit for those that are here and jumping into network automation. If we kind of bring it back to the business, I kind of look at this, and this was mentioned probably in a lot of the presentations this morning about these like vertically integrated silos, domain managers. It could be growth through M&A. But at the end of the day, we're still managing things in a very siloed manner. And I think it's sort of one of the main reasons we're here is to think about how can we manage infrastructure and networks differently. That way we're able to do things like more complex workflows that span these vertically integrated pillars, domains. It could be a team, organization. So stop the madness. How do we do better? I'm a huge Shark Tank fan. Anybody else? Any Shark Tank fans in here? No? Maybe in the US maybe. But Kevin O'Leary here is, stop the madness. Like, we have to do better as an industry. And so again, I'm super happy to be here today, and I think this is a huge step in the right direction to be able to communicate and collaborate as a community. So build versus buy. Again, I love the question, and I'll probably dodge it for a little bit, or for most of the conversation. But in reality, I would say we simplified in build versus buy. But even with build, like, do we mean build from scratch, or do we mean use open source and kind of tailor it to our liking? Same thing with buy. Do we mean buy commercial tools, or is it buying product support for open source tooling? And even with these two questions under each of them, it's never black or white, right? It's just sort of realize that as we kind of go down this journey and think about platforms and tools that make sense. So it's the wrong question. And again, I think just giving credit back to Pete's talk, it's like value. What's the business value? What problems are we trying to solve? And I think also often, we do live in that tool-centric world that we can't forget as we embark on this journey what problems are most important. And the macro problem is automate the network, but even within there, it's what is the most common thing right now? Where is the most value for the business? Those questions have to be asked. And I would say, to be open, I think for me, I think about like both schools of camp on the opposite end of the spectrum is those that live and breathe open source, be open to buying a commercial tool, and those who have only ever bought tools, be open to using open source. I think it kind of level sets. In this day and age, we're seeing progression on both sides, and it's just so important to not be too religious one way or the other, and to make sure that at the end of the day, we're solving problems and adding value back to the business. So no answer for me. This goes back to tools, right? It's just sort of taking a step back, looking at the problems. But here, even today, I'll focus more on workflows and data. It's really kind of evident that as those newer to embarking on the journey, like the workflows go back to that business value. What are we trying to accomplish? And then from there, we can kind of see what that is, and then ultimately the data required to be able to drive that. Understanding that even before we start saying, hey, which tools are we gonna use? I'll fast forward through these. This is just showcasing effectively. There's a lot of tools on the market, right? Many of them in the room. Itential, IP Fabric. There's probably others in the room as well from other manufacturers and OEMs. Open source projects, right? Again, many folks here are probably using open source already. If not, they might be after this kind of event. Then there's integrations on top: ServiceNow, Remedy, Chat. And then I really feel like a lot of us in the room are sort of like stuck in the middle, right? How do we make all this work? That's why it goes back to really understanding the workflows, because at the end of the day, you understand the workflows, then you can kind of figure out what do you need to solve a workflow in production. And here I'll kind of give maybe one leg up to the open source space in the sense that if you're trying to solve a problem, trying to solve a workflow, you Google something, find a project, you can download it, get it going. And it's sort of like that time to deliver even an initial prototype or POC, it has that probably slight edge in being able to give something back to the business. Open source IAC, right? I think a lot of us in this room, right, are using open source, just sort of like the general gut feeling. I could just go back to, I screen capped these a while back actually, a lot of the major OEMs here: Juniper, Cisco, Arista, again, IP Fabric, we have Itential, like all of them showcasing, I feel like a lot of integrations that exist: Terraform, Ansible, Salt, Nautobot, NetBox, all of these sort of open source technologies that I feel like it's always great to see the integrations from the large manufacturers. And I look at it as like taking a step back in the sense that this is great because The one reason, well, I think that is open source IAC is actually driving the industry. Look at the operational models that it really employs. And so it's ultimately some of these like pure Python integrations, some of these are tooling integrations, and so like, taking note of this is sort of what's pulling the trends. And a lot of that I do believe to be sort of NetDevOps, open source, IAC, a lot of these principles that we're talking about throughout today. Going back to the Venn diagram, I'll always go back, I'll always kind of refer to that in my head, is that one tool can't do it all, if we're talking about like solving real challenges, workflow challenges. And I've said workflow a lot, and so for me it's sort of, what is a workflow? This is a term that comes up, I would say, for us with clients every day. Some folks get it, some folks are trying to understand, well, what is a workflow? I just go back to like, there's the perception of it. It's some of the tasks that we have to do every day. And there's some like basic ones here that just sort of are more pervasive in the industry, turning up a peer, adding a VLAN, assigning a VLAN to an interface, all these things. And for me in my career, I feel like when I first hear these, there's a workflow or a task, it's always like 2 to 5 words, right? It's always a few words, and we're almost not doing ourselves service to say there's all this work, but you can say it in 3 seconds. But when you really peel back the onion in a production environment, this is from medium enterprise, large enterprise, it's probably an hours long discussion to go through all the steps required to do that. And so it's kind of, on the left, I'd say the perception is really more task-based things, and then there's the reality of a full workflow, end-to-end, opening the change request. Again, if it's a large financial, healthcare, a lot more artifacts to sort of build and prepare for it. Pre-change commands, which commands to run, expected output. It could be backup plans, rollback plans, all of these things. And that really is kind of being able to think through all of the steps that would be required to bring a workflow into production. So I'm saying a workflow, it's really all the steps required to perform some operation on the network. Most commonly, people talk about changes, but it could be troubleshooting steps, right? All the things, we'll say, if you were to hire a new employee that starts tomorrow, and you were away for 3 months, how would they know what to do, right? That's a complete workflow kind of going end to end. For years, I've been talking about user experience for network automation. One of my biggest fears of network automation is it becomes the network management of yesterday. I go back to a prior career, did bombs every day. Some are small, some are large, 50 grand, $5 million. Network management goes in the bomb. It's either reduced, scratched, or bought and not used. And so for me, it's so important to think about, as we're thinking about the workflows to automate based on business value, what's the right way to expose them back to the business and knowing who the consumers are of those workflows. So one example here could be ServiceNow. Maybe it's a business user or that type of persona, that workflow. Could be firewall, could be application deployment. Doesn't matter. We've done a lot with chat ops. Again, Slack, Teams, Mattermost, WebEx Teams. Again, doesn't really matter the chat type, but it's sort of, if it's a service desk, help desk, maybe tier 1 operators, to allow them to do repeatable tasks. I don't mean changes, right? It could be to get data, it doesn't really matter what it is, but to think about the right interface. Self-service forms, right? It could be all about job, NetBox script, doesn't really matter. It could be some sort of self-service to deliver it. It could be Ansible, AWX, Tower, again, doesn't matter. It could be a GitOps workflow. So here, the point is in every one of these forms, the entries are the same. And so this is where you can't let the technology drive how the users have to consume it, right? If it was everything is ServiceNow, everything is chat, everything is GitOps, and then ask, and we've seen this, everything is GitOps, 2 years later, no one's using it. Do they know Git? Do they know YAML? Do they know all of these skills required to be able to drive that? And so the culture and I'll go back to the workflow is so important. And this could be done per workflow, right? If you kind of have like that platform approach, the automation, orchestration engine under the covers, you can expose whichever one makes sense, and kind of A/B test it to see which one has the most adoption. And again, I look at it from our perspective, engaging with clients. It's a lose-lose if something's deployed and not used. So it's so important to really think about the culture of an organization, the people that are going to consume it every day, and really talk to them and allow them to prototype different interfaces to make sure that it can be adopted. So for us, workflows are everything, and this is sort of an aside analogy that I like, and hopefully clicks for others. But we live in this world. It's like cloud. Clouds are cool. I think in general, cloud. Just saying cloud to me isn't solving operational problems or on-prem networks. Clearly, we really mean sort of the operational models behind cloud. And so when I think about it, it's really that automation first cloud operational model that we're kind of figuring out, right? All that makes sense to be able to adopt the right things for the network. So along the same conversation, kind of going from workflows, now I'm kind of going to dive into extensibility. This one is I think paramount. Get independent of tool selection, open source, building 100% custom commercial tooling. Like, it's really a matter of how extensible is it? And I'll keep going back to, are we deploying the network management of yesterday that might not get used for whatever reason? Can we tailor deployments? I'll go back to some comments earlier about Ansible versus Python, and I'll say even at Network to Code, over the past several years, there's hundreds of projects and workflows deployed, even the ones where it was Ansible driven or another tool. As a services business, it's just sort of being neutral on what's being used. Almost, if I had to guess, it's 99% or 100%. There's either 5 lines of Python written or 5,000. Right, 500, whatever the number is, but no matter any tool in the market is for a solution is integrated to other systems, and like it or not, almost every company has internal tools, internal systems, where there might not be plug and play solutions that are available. So, this to me isn't a bad thing, right? Even in that example, if you're familiar and you're in Ansible, custom module, sometimes I might start custom Jinja filter. You can abstract away, again, I agree, nested loops, or maybe it's managing data in Ansible, might not be the greatest, but if you can solve it in a custom filter, custom module, and still take advantage of the framework that it provides, sure, use it. If you have to kind of bounce out and go into Python a couple hours a month, the idea to migrate seems a bit premature, right? If you swap it where you're in Python almost all the time, then maybe think twice about where the limitations could be for the organization. And even going back to the early days, having been involved now for a long time in network automation, I remember in 2014, 15, 16, trying to promote Ansible for networking, and Ansible literally had no employees that did networking. And it was the community at large that kind of pulled Ansible in that direction. And it was only due to the extensibility, right? Open source modules existed, and eventually, it took years, eventually hired a person, a second person, and built out a team. And then clearly, they invested a lot of time and energy to build out the collections and the modules that they announced over the past 7, 8 years. But enterprise governance, all of these things, data management, how do you enforce everything from a naming standard to policy enforcement? Right? These things are more possible with extensibility. Big one on the bottom, like planning through, going back to that, network management is scrapped from a bomb. You deploy one vendor today, likely in 3 to 5 years, 6 years, whatever time frame it is, you'll do a tech refresh. And maybe it's sooner, just based on if you deployed it already. Network automation is starting now, maybe in your environment. How do you make sure you're not going to have to replace your new operational model when you change platforms or vendors? And so this is where they kind of have to be tied at the hip, right? If you're doing an RFP for network equipment, network devices, and things like that, fabrics, really understand how it'll tie into an overall network automation framework and platform. Extensibility, oftentimes in this conversation, we're talking about code, right? Again, Jinja filters, custom module, all these things. I have some screenshots here. For those wondering, that's not NetBox. Looks very similar at times. But highlighting here extensibility to the UI, like knowing the user. And here, I'll kind of go left to right at the top. Left is sort of injecting content on the home page. Devices drop down, probably a lot of folks have seen over the years from NetBox, now an Autobot, very similar. The ability to inject a new menu item via plugin. On the right, up top, build and config, that's a new menu item. On the bottom, it's a new tab, governance. So it's all these things that having a platform that supports extensibility, that way if you needed governance or needed a way to view controllers, you're not building another interface. Even controllers is a good one. This is a newer one for us, not open source yet, hopefully soon, but in the sense it kind of just simplifies the view of controllers. You want to view all your controllers. It could be CVP, it could be even Meraki. It could be as a cloud system, ACI, whatever it is. You could still store that without that controller view, but it's like the mind of the network engineer. You want to view your controllers in maybe one pane of glass. So one idea is custom report, or it could be a third-party tool, queries the API, builds that interface for you. But it's just really empowering the users to be able to tailor a solution, because ultimately requirements can be different, and just the culture is different around maybe even terminology and how teams view certain things. So really important. So build versus buy. Define the problem. Again, workflows are so important. In orange, if you can't document it, you have to ask yourself, like, can you automate it? And so it's so important. You kind of see the conceptual workflow diagrams. You should be able to do that on a complex or a basic workflow. At the end of the day, how could you start automating if you're not sure what the process is? And this is really, I always go back and I'll summarize with this too for the talk, but if you're hiring a new employee on your team, this workflow, this is pre-automation. Being able to document it, so whatever tools are chosen, you're gonna go faster than you would if you're gonna pick a tool first, then document, and then the business is gonna wanna know what's taking so long, right? Think about the workflows before you start adopting and deploying tools. Next two sections are a bit quicker, source of truth. For this audience, probably fairly more well understood, so I'll keep this one quick. Again, for us, like many in the room, this is defining the intent of the network. 20 plus years, all we had was a config on the device. There's really no idea of what should it be. There might have been tools to sort of check things after, but from a data perspective, what should drive configuration? And look at a house. Just imagine trying to build a house without a blueprint or without a plan. So what was the intent? How did you know how much wood or brick or materials to go after? And you look at all the benefit of kind of source of truth, data first. For one, it could drive automation, but two, you start thinking about even refresh cycles, all these things. You could even build, again, through extensions, cost analysis to look at even like the cost of a site, cost of a campus, having all the data in a common location. This is obviously really high level, but very, very traditional in terms of the path of adopting source of truth. This is where a lot of the industry has been over the past several years. Again, everyone's on that different sliding scale of where they are on the journey. Is it month one, year two? But at some point, has everyone here used a spreadsheet at some point in their career to IP addresses, inventory? Yeah, at least one point. And a lot of that is sort of on its way out. But even now, those that are automated, there might be pockets of inventory, policies, BGP data. It doesn't really matter what it is, but spreadsheets is really kind of ground zero. And then step one is migrating from spreadsheets. The most common next step today has been YAML. And not right or wrong, but I think it's actually a really good thing in the sense that if you're thinking about YAML, you are thinking about intended configuration on the device. Odds are, if you have anything in YAML, there's a tool that's picking up the YAML and building a configuration or an API call to configure a device. I think here's where, again, there's always differences of opinions and thoughts, but you can get to hundreds or thousands of YAML files, or you can even get to thousands of lines of YAML in one file, and they're brittle. And I'll say even step one, going to YAML, if you're using YAML, probably means using Git. Using Git, GitLab or GitHub, it probably means you're thinking about or should have some sort of pipeline, maybe to test the data to ensure things aren't going to get foobarred if there's bad data in there. Or it could be good structured YAML, but indented wrong in the wrong place to generate bad configuration, right? So there's this decision, I feel like in this step two, if we were to look at inventory, BGP ASNs, VLAN IDs, VRFs, SNMP, AAA, NTP, 30 or 40 network services, to go one at a time, where should they be documented? Is it in YAML, or is it in the source of truth database, right, on the right? And clearly, top of mind, right, Autobot, NetBox, right, sort of what we're seeing. ServiceNow CMDB, doesn't really matter what it is, but it's trying to think about some of the decision factors. As I mentioned, it could be skills, right? It could be Linux, it could be Git, as a concern or a thought for using YAML. Or it might drive you to use a database if you need API access, if you want to have programmatic access to make that. And if skills A is a thought, you're supposed to be thinking about how large is the team, meaning if the team of network engineers don't have those skills, or you want to open up the team, we've even seen project managers to add a device or do something as part of a project, having a UI could make sense as well. So it's really a discussion and decision to make. But I wouldn't look at it sort of as absolutes. It's more or less trying to look at the pieces of data and what makes sense, what's more static, what's more variable, and then also clearly where skills are in an organization. Next level, kind of tying this together. On the left, we see network designs, pretty common, where there's networking designs, Word docs that kind of define standards. Think your t-shirt sizes, maybe a small site. Could be single router, dual circuit, or two routers, dual circuits each. But it's all sort of in a document. They think about kind of codifying that design with data so you could easily deploy a new closet, deploy a new device, and then generate the required data that could then be used and fetched by said automation tool. But it's so important to kind of deconstruct and decouple data from syntax. Really think about, it goes back to how you think about migrations, right? You think about if you can decouple data, then it could be Cisco, Juniper, Arista, controllers, traditional devices, doesn't really matter, but think about it in a data first manner. That way it allows you more flexibility and portability to have data drive network automation. Circling back to earlier, talking like the perception of a workflow, which is a task, kind of the reality, complex workflows, and then ultimately to drive a workflow, where's the data coming from? When you think about all, what's in orange on the right, all these things, or IP addresses, ASNs, VLAN IDs, all these integers, even just how things should be constructed, interface descriptions, all of this could be stored as data to drive the network. And without it, ultimately, again, in all of these tasks, one of them might have been to make the change, right, and hope, but there's a lot of work in certain organizations to gather data. We've seen anything from half a dozen to dozens of data sources, right, to be being used to ultimately to be able to build a configuration that exists on a network device. Cool, so last section around transformation of really careers, skills, ultimately tying it back to the business around thinking about that transformation going from where we are today, ultimately to where we want to be as an individual and as a team. I'll start with the graphic on the right. This is what we use commonly to talk to customers about in terms of roles and titles. I think sometimes it could seem like there's only one persona of a type of engineer. Meaning you have network engineer, and then you're sort of automation, software, you're the one spearheading automation development. And you might hear, well, I'm not a developer, I'm an automation engineer, or a variety of things like that. At the end of the day, you kind of look at who's the customer of who, right? Network engineers need the right tools, need the right workflows to automate. So it could be a network automation engineer that helps build some of those workflows. But I would say when they need help, it goes beyond the skill set. You might have more traditional network automation developers, software engineers to be able to do that. And then ultimately kind of have this network automation architect that understands more of like the platform approach on how all the things are gonna come together. And I'll say in terms of where we are as an industry, there's a network engineer. Here we've called it network development engineer. This is sort of, the belief is when we look at the industry years from now, not going to state a number because I think I've learned things move slower than we'd like. I thought this was going to change 10 years ago, and I've gotten a lot of grays, lost more hair in here since I thought we were going to change quicker as an industry, but things take time. And so the NDE title is basically that next-gen network engineer, where it's networking skill sets for sure, but it's also things like Git, YAML, JSON, being able to edit files in a text editor, contribute back to a GitOps workflow, but still be able to converse with the teams of automation engineers that are building workflows day to day, okay? And then here, first two bullets on the left is kind of the delineation of the evolution of doing more and more automation. You'll end up down the path of sort of a platform approach, core platforms, core tools that comprise the framework, platform itself, and then those that are going to be maybe in their verticals contributing back to it. You want to automate firewalls, switches, routers, load balancers, what have you. And I'll say bottom bullet, training class isn't enough. And again, I've taught a lot over the years, and clearly just expecting, go to a CCNA boot camp, and should you expect that person to be able to manage a WAN, LAN data center? Probably not. So I think it's so important for leadership to invest, and we've seen over the years, as a network engineer, you're going to get 5% of your time for network automation. It's a joke, right? How could you do anything in 2 hours a week? Even 10%, 20%, kind of need that larger investment. Here's a visual. I'll go quick. I know we're running out of time, but we have the NDE, automation engineer and architect. It kind of shows, this is one viewpoint. You can have like skills, skills get mapped throughout. It's really important to kind of think about the needs of your team, your organization, and what it could mean, because at the end of the day, titles might change, right, in your organization, being able to showcase the learned skills. Finally, big point is skills to objectives. You can go down this path of like learn, but again, what are you trying to do? Right, so if you can kind of start at the end, the objectives are A, B, C, D, or E, and reverse engineer and take the time to think about that learning path, you could then do things collectively as a team. And again, it could be tools, technology, open source, commercial, doesn't really matter. But even if you're going to go buy a tool, build a tool, download a tool, there's that time and really the details of that tool that make sense to learn on a journey. It's not just go learn X, right? Break X down into a sprint or to a program increment, whatever makes sense, okay? So let's go. This is it. So in summary, if you can't document it, ask yourself, can you automate it? Extensibility is key, and always be learning. That's the mantra. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jason. We have time for questions. There we go. Is this on? It is. Good.
Hi, Sebastian from Next Packet again. I have a question. On your slide 26, you were talking about data-driven networks.
Mm-hmm.
And before you were talking about the importance of workflows. Of course, with workflows, it's very hard to do data-driven networks, right? Because you have a declarative management style. And so my question is, if I understand what you're describing here with data-driven networks, is about take everything that's in the spec in the database and make it the reality in production, then what do you do with something that you find in production but you do not find in your source of truth?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll answer two questions, because you had one earlier about like multiple sources as well. But yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, like the progression has to be tied back to the organization. And so even going back to a declarative model, are we there in networking to do things like Puppet and Chef were doing years ago in terms of if it's not there, it's going to get overwritten? No, I don't think we're there yet. But in terms of, I do believe how we look at compliance should be sort of a data first approach in terms of have your data gen configuration, compare what's on the device, and ultimately see if there's extra configuration on the device. Build a process, could be a human process, back to be able to reconcile the data. There's, clearly there could be a process for, again, brownfield onboarding of data, parsing data, and adding it automatically. But I would say, given the philosophical thoughts on source of truth, the automated reconciliation probably is not a great thing in certain organizations. It's basically trying to go, piece of data by piece of data, and to say, does it make sense to reconcile, add to database, or keep as is if it was added for troubleshooting or something along those lines.
Is that me? Hey Jason, thanks for being here. Awesome talk. My question, what I'm driving at really is where you're at with the DOLT database for version controlled database compliance. But I guess my perspective is, so we're leveraging tools like NetDevOps to define our intent. Of course, we've got tools out there like IP Fabric to determine actuality, infrastructure as code to remediate the gap between the two. That's where you need to bring engineering effort to bear. But, so the NetBox or NetBox becomes sacrosanct because it's your intent. So very useful to have a mechanism. The consequence of that is you have a small clique of people that are defining that intent within an organization. Super powerful to have something like a DOLT database for version control. I know there's a bunch of complexities with it. There's been a bit of a lead time in you getting that into production. Where are you at? What are your thoughts regarding version-controlled databases?
Yeah, I think you've asked quite a bit, I think, right? Yeah. So it's, so I'll kind of summarize. The question is, where are we at sort of with this thing called the DOLT database with Nautilbot? For those who haven't heard of DOLT, DOLT is, it's a database. You look at MySQL, Postgres, and there's DOLT. Under the covers, kind of DOLT speaks MySQL, but it's this sort of database that offers Git semantics, right? So you can sort of like stage a change in a branch and then propose that change and kind of view the impact. And the idea is basically to be able to have like the benefits of, I would say, YAML and Git inside Nautilbot. We released a plugin over a year ago, probably. That's sort of been in this alpha state. DOLT itself just went 1.0 within the past several weeks. We're working on sort of major release for Nautilbot 2.0 in the next probably few months. The goal is this calendar year. I'm being recorded, so we'll do what we can to keep true to that. But we're still a few months away. After we get 2.0 out the door, there's some model changes and breaking changes there. So it'll mean refactoring that DOLT plugin to be more compatible with 2.0. To be quite honest, I think we were just early. It was sort of early in the game. Feedback has been good, and there's been lots of interest. And we're hoping, realistically, it's probably Q4, Q1 around being able to bring that back to the community.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll be quick because people probably want lunch. You mentioned about automation solutions being implemented and then potentially abandoned a couple of months later. You can provide the best documentation and training in the world, but how do you find with your customers that you're getting that cultural shift and making sure that things are being adopted when you leave? People love the CLI, so how do you work with your customers? What do you find works?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And like this is where I don't necessarily know if there's one answer in terms of you talk about like what hasn't worked and what we've seen sort of work and kind of figure that out. But I think starting with there's always, if I go back to like, DevOps, I remember over the years, there was, there shouldn't be a DevOps engineer. It should be like pervasive across all the skills. We want to enable things across all engineers. And I think ultimately the goal is similar in the networking space, but in order to get traction and get steam, it has work to be able to have that smaller group, to be able to build the architecture, build the standards, even work on a rollout plan for education. And I think being more realistic in terms of what to expect when you truly are going from zero and trying to roll out, I'll say again, like I wanted the spectrum, IAC, steady pipelines, like there's so much to learn. This goes back to that, the one slide about having the objectives along the way, meaning if you have a pipeline, just getting folks to be able to edit YAML, could be, a nice phase to edit literally one IP address in a YAML file. So I would say, realistically, as I've joked over the years, 10 years ago, I literally thought industry was going to change overnight. And now I think there's some folks that are probably in this room, they think that because of maybe your skills organizationally, you should change overnight in your enterprise or where you work. But realistically, if you kind of level set, hey, maybe this is a 2 to a 3 year journey, how do you think differently about ramping up your team to get there?
All right, that's all we've got time for now. However, we are going into lunch, so you can definitely swarm Jason and keep him away from his food. Thanks for that,
Thank you
Jason.
so much.
Let's get another round of applause.